Hello, and here we go with the humanistic perspective. So by the 1960s, psychologists are going to be discontent with Freud and his negative views, that idea that we're driven by sexual and aggressive drives. Even though Freud's position in history is really important and that he moved people away from this eugenics thinking and focusing on the parent-child relationship, at least for the first 5 years. But then on the other hand, you have the behaviorists who swing the pendulum entirely in the nurture direction, not thinking so much about, parenting and that sort of thing, but controlling behavior through reinforcement. So you have Skinner, Watson, Thorndike, Pavlov. All of these theorists are thinking more about how you're responding to conditioning and not about what your personal feelings are. Nobody's asking you. An insight therapist is not asking you how you feel about stuff. A behavioral therapist is not concerned with how you feel about things. And Maslow and Rogers are going to come in and say, whoa, like you actually matter. You are the center of your experience, and thus what you're feeling about stuff, it does actually matter. It was disregarded by the previous theorists. What you may notice, though, with Maslow and Rogers is that standalone humanistic therapy doesn't have a lot of empirical support to suggest that it works. But I think it would be crazy to do therapy without incorporating the humanistic perspective, because what they add is, I think, essential to helping other types of therapy work. But that's editorializing. And I think you remember Maslow's hierarchy of needs from the motivation unit. You probably also learned about it in biology class. And what could be more relevant than Maslow's hierarchy right now, as we are looking at a global pandemic? Some of basic questions need to be answered, like, are people's physiological needs being met? So it seems absurd if I'm thinking about, like, hey, are you guys preparing for the AP exam if your basic needs aren't being met? So for those kids across the country, even the world, who are in a situation now where they don't have access to basic needs right now, no, the AP exam is an absurd thing to ask of them, I would say. Because if you're starving, if you've got no place to live, why would you be concerned about a college board exam? You just wouldn't be. And then there are the safety needs. If you don't feel safe, you're also not able to attend to learning. And then you also need to feel like you belong, your self-esteem needs, which we'll look at very specifically, and ultimately you want to become self-actualized. And I'll explain what that is, but where you're reaching your full potential. So in order to define what self-actualization is, Maslow studied healthy and successful people and found that they had some common characteristics. I have some of them listed here for you. They're self-aware, self-accepting, open, spontaneous, loving, caring. They're not as influenced or affected by the opinions of others. They have a strong identity. They're problem-centered, not self-centered, and a few deep relationships instead of many light relationships. So they'll have a couple close friends, not a million so-so friends. So Rogers, on the other hand, his big thing was put the individual back into the therapy session. So it's not about stuff that happened to them. They're not a passive recipient of what was happening in their world. What the person thinks of their situation matters. And I think almost any therapy session should start with a complaint. You come in and you say, like, this is why I'm here. And let's say the problem is I can't sleep. Now, I want to make sure I address your complaint. There may be an underlying problem. It could be medical, it could be psychological, maybe depression or a different psychiatric issue. It could be a disruption to your circadian rhythm, what have you, but that complaint is what I need to address because that's what you identify as the problem. The rest of it that I uncover that supports it will be what I'd be working on as we go along in a therapeutic situation. And Rogers said what is essential to therapy is this idea of unconditional positive regard, this attitude of acceptance. It would be sort of like love, except for it's unconditional. So no matter what a person does or says, that you accept them regardless of their failings. So if you go into a therapy session and you say, listen, I did this bad thing, and your therapist is shocked and seems to like you less now, that's a problem. So to that end, Rogers said, for his brand of therapy, this person-centered or client-centered therapy, there are 3 conditions that you want to promote personal growth. So you have to be genuine. open with your feelings and ideas, acceptance, this unconditional positive regard. So I accept you as you are with all of your faults. I can separate that out. And empathy. I wanted you to know that I recognize and can mirror a person's emotions. And he said, what you want to do is practice unconditional positive regard over conditional positive regard. So again, that unconditional positive regard is that you give this positive feelings towards the person regardless of what they have done. The conditional positive regard is where you only like somebody when they're doing the right thing. So if I were going to treat my class with conditional positive regard, it's like, oh, you studied for a test and you did well, so therefore I'll be nice to you. You don't study for a test, you get caught cheating or whatever, you just don't do your homework assignments, then you get treated like you're not as good. That would be conditional positive regard. And he said that would block personal growth. And let's face it, it certainly blocks honesty, right? If you tell me the truth about something and I'm going to judge you for it, you're not likely to tell me. And I know from being a parent, the number of times that my kids will do something and I'll have to say, listen, I love you, but I don't love what you did. And I have to separate those two things out. You and your actions are not the same. Rogers has this idea of self-theory. So again, you are the center of your experience. So you and your complaint and what's important to you is what matters in the therapeutic scenario. So the sense of being I or me is going to make me different in my likes and dislikes and the way I interact with my environment. The self-concept, who am I? I have a positive self-concept, then I'll be happy and secure. If I have a negative self-concept, I'll be dissatisfied and unhappy. And in a therapeutic situation, that's where the work would need to be done. And at the end, the goal is for somebody to develop self-esteem, this confidence in one's own worth or abilities, this self-respect that you would have for yourself. And finally here, in terms of evaluating Rogers and Maslow, you want to know that their ideas influence education, it influences management, it influences parenting, therapy, it should influence all of this. It was also really important that they added the self to therapy, the importance of self-esteem and your self-concept. But know for criticisms that it doesn't really work from an empirical standpoint as a standalone. It works well as a good add-on. Mostly really because a lot of the ideas that they describe tend to be a bit more on the vague side. They also push that kind of individual comfort and interest over the group. So it works better in individualistic cultures. And I think one final criticism here would be that there are some people that you could argue are not deserving of unconditional positive regard. And I do think that you need to recognize that. So if I'm working as a therapist and somebody comes in and they were a mass murderer, I could not separate them from their actions, and therefore I could not give them unconditional positive regard.